Today is Monday, November 1st. It's All Saints' Day, so happy All Saints' Day to everyone. And what I'd like to do over the next many months, likely, is use my walk talks to begin meditating on the great works of classical literature. One reason I'd like to do this is because I'm going to have students working through these works in my English literature course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, which you're all welcome to study for free. And I don't want to present classical literature to students in the context of modern schooling, because that's not where it belongs. The first book that we're going to walk through and study is Homer's Iliad. These books were not designed to serve as textbooks in schools. They were not intended to be studied by idle children sitting in desks. They were intended to be studied, meditated on, and discussed by men. Just to provide some background, Homer was a Greek poet. He wasn't a historian. He didn't write in prose like J.R. Tolkien. He was a poet. Some believe he recited his poems while an assistant accompanied him with some music, whether it was a harp or an ancient flute. But he was a poet, and he composed his poems in Greek and recited them in public, likely in banquets. They were both a form of entertainment and a form of moral and religious and philosophical instruction. Quite an impressive and respectable form of entertainment. Quite an impressive idea of adult culture to come together for a banquet or a party of some kind and have a philosopher sing a poem that he had composed, which teaches on every topic of a virtuous life. That was the role of Homer's poems in the ancient world. These poems, as I said, were written in Greek. The Iliad consists of 24 books. And every line of these 24 books of poetry is written in a particular meter. The meter was called dactylic hexameter. It was the meter used by the ancient epic poets, by Homer, later by Virgil. Dactylic hexameter. So when you look at that inch-thick book on the shelf titled Homer's Iliad, the first thing that I want you to think about is that this is a massive work of poetry, an incredible work of art. As for the meter, as I said, the name of the meter is dactylic hexameter. The word dactylic means finger-like. It's called finger-like because if you hold up your index finger, you'll see that your finger divides into 3 parts. The first part of your finger, from the big knuckle on your hand out to the first knuckle on your finger, is long, and the 2 sections of your index finger from the middle of your finger out to the tip are smaller. So it's a long part of a finger followed by 2 short parts. And that's the structure of one part or one foot of Homer's poetry. So as for the rhythm and measure, it's a long syllable followed by 2 short syllables. So it has a rhythm like da, di, di, da, di, di, da, di, di. Long, short, short, long, short, short, long, short, short. That's what is meant by dactylic. The entire poem, all 24 books, has this rhythm. Da, 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 da. The second part of the name of the verse is hexameter. H-E-X, hex, hexameter. And what that means is 6 measures. 6 measures. So in every line of Homer's poetry, every line is made up of 6 dactyls, or 6 fingers, to help you remember it. So every line of the poem has this structure. And let's just go through 6 dactyls. Long, short, short, 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 long, short, short. That would be 6 dactyls. Every single line of Homer's Iliad, all 24 books in the original Greek, followed that measure or some variation of that measure. That's the meter of this whole entire book. And I want you to realize that, because when we translate Homer into English, that whole aspect of his work is lost. The poetry of Homer is lost in English translation. And I want you to always remember that anytime you think about or talk about Homer, I want you to remember that talking about Homer without knowing and studying his poetry would be like talking about Mozart without hearing his music, or a great hymn writer. It's like reading the Psalter without the chant. And one of the reasons why we don't respect the work of Homer today, like men did in the ancient world, is because when we see Homer in English translation, we see this stripped down shadow of the real work. Where men study classical literature and have access to the original language, Homer is seen in a completely different light than he's seen among students who are merely reading English translations of his poetry. And for Homer's honor's sake, I'd like to ask you to always keep that in mind. That when we study Homer in English translation, it's not the translation that should concern us, but the lack of awareness of Homer's actual poetic skills. The Iliad and the Odyssey, a total of 48 books that teach philosophy, religion, history, mythology, principles of war and government, family life. A work that teaches, in its very words and lines, teaches the arts of reasoning and rhetoric. These were composed and presented to men as if that weren't enough, as a work of poetry. That's how amazing Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were. And you can imagine how much more amazing they were when recited in the ancient world, where so few people were literate, so few people had that kind of education. These works were considered almost magical, divinely inspired, and I'd like to look into that theme a little bit as we get started studying the poem. So as I said, this is Homer's Iliad, not to be confused with the Odyssey, and also not to be confused with Virgil's Aeneid. All three of these stories relate to the history of the Trojan War. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were wrote from a Greek perspective. Virgil's Aeneid was written from a Roman perspective much later. Homer wrote in 750 BC. So just take a minute and get that into your mind. 750 BC. 750 years before the Christian era. If we're to compare that with sacred history, the history of ancient Israel, biblical history, it's good to have as a reference point the fact that King David, who wrote the Psalms, was king around 1000 BC. And his son Solomon, who wrote the Proverbs, was king beginning around, let's say, 950 BC. So Homer was as close to King Solomon, or even closer. Homer was closer to King Solomon than we are to the founders of the United States of America. The Constitution is as old to us as the Proverbs of Solomon would have been to Homer. Just let that sink in. Rome was founded, the city of Rome was founded in 753 BC. That's the time of Homer. Homer was in Greece. Rome, at the time, was unknown. That's when the city was founded, 753 BC. It was ruled, Rome that is, by 7 kings until the Republic was founded in 509 BC. The Roman Republic was founded 250 years after Homer composed the Iliad and the Odyssey in Greece. The Roman Empire that we think of in history, when we think of names like Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Augustus, and so on, was founded in 31 BC, just after the death of Julius Caesar, when Augustus was named emperor. That's 720 years after Homer. So try and put Homer into his place historically in your mind. 200 years after Solomon. 200 years after the Proverbs of Solomon were composed. If we go back further to provide some more historical context, we could say that Moses and the Hebrews left Egypt around 1400 BC. Around 1400 BC, and the Trojan War is dated to around 1200 BC. So let's string these events together to get the chronological context in mind. The people of God leave Egypt around 1400. So when you're reading through the Old Testament, when you're reading through Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua, you're reading the history of the world, the history of the Middle East, around 1400 BC. The Trojan War takes place in Troy, which is between Greece and Israel, around 1200 BC, 200 years after the Exodus. If you read the book of Judges in the Bible, the Old Testament, you read the book of Judges, you're basically reading the history of the time of the Trojan War. And so the first reason why any opportunity we have to learn about the Trojan War is helpful is because it gives us windows of insight into the life of men in the time of the judges, between Moses and David. So the Trojan War should always be of interest to us for its biblical value. Then we have the kingdom of David, around 1000. Solomon, in his famous kingdom, the wisest man in the world, around 950 BC. And then 200 years later, in Greece, we have Homer, the famous ancient poet, composing the Iliad and the Odyssey. He writes of the Trojan War, the events of the Trojan War, and he does so 450 years after those events take place. And so he relies on what must have been an ancient oral tradition that preserved the memory of the famous Trojan War and its heroes. And he's got another source that I'm going to talk about as we get into the poem. But Homer is writing in 750 BC, telling of events that took place around 1200 BC, 200 years after Solomon's reign in Israel, around the same time that the Roman city was being founded. The famous events of Romulus and Remus, if you know the history. 250 years before the founding of the Roman Republic. 720 years or so before the founding of the Roman Empire. The first book, titled the Iliad, it's titled the Iliad because Troy, what we call Troy, in Greece is called Ilion. And the Iliad is the story of Troy. The Odyssey, the second book, is named after its chief character, Odysseus. And those are the two famous works of Homer. Both, as I said, 24 books long, both written in Greek, both written in dactylic hexameter, around 750 years before Christ. And we always have to keep that chronology in mind as we get into these studies. So what I'd like to do on my walks, and I'm not going to do this in consecutive walks, but day by day, we'll simply read a bit from the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we'll just work our way little by little through these ancient works. And I intend to use these talks, and these are unscripted talks that are going to focus much more on the meditations that flow from these works and applications in our lives than on just trying to rush through the works themselves like an artificial class would do in a school. I'd like to read, reflect on, and apply the content, at least, because we're going to read it in English here. I'd like to read, reflect on, and apply the contents of Homer's Iliad to our lives as Catholic men living 2,800 years later. Remember Solomon's teaching. There is nothing new under the sun. So let's begin together the reading of Homer's Iliad. And as I said, I'm going to stop and comment quite a bit because the purpose of this study is not to get through the book. You can do that on your own if you'd like to just read it or listen to it on an audiobook. The purpose of this is to go through these works slowly, in detail, and try and squeeze every drop that we can get out of them for our own meditation and self-improvement, to grow in wisdom and virtue, which was the purpose of these poems. Like I said, not to be read by children in a K-12 workplace readiness program, but to be studied by free men for the sake of their own pursuit of virtue and happiness. So I'm going to begin Book 1 of the Iliad. The last thing I'd like to say is that I'm going to read an English translation of Homer, but not a prose translation. I'm going to read a poetic translation that was made by one of the great English poets, Alexander Pope. And the reason why I prefer to read poetic translations is because the poets have a respect for the writing of the ancient poets that prose translators don't have. And by reading the poem in poetic translation, it helps us to remember that this is a work of poetry and not just a story. So we're going to read Alexander Pope's English translation of Homer's Iliad. So if you'd like to read along or just read the work as we go through it through these months, you can find a copy on the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website. Just go to classicalliberalaarts.com/library. And if you scroll down to the humanities section, you'll see links to the text of Homer's Iliad, and that's the version that I'm reading. So Alexander Pope's translation of Homer's Iliad. Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. Achilles' wrath. That's the subject of Homer's Iliad. The wrath of Achilles. Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring. Achilles' wrath was the spring of unnumbered woes. The direful spring of unnumbered woes, heavenly goddess, sing. The very opening lines of the Iliad express a prayer. And I'd like to ask you not to dismiss this with the typical arrogance of modern fundamentalists. I'd like you to consider that Homer could have started this poem in any way he pleased. He could have started this poem praising himself and introducing the work he was about to present, celebrating himself and calling everyone to pay attention to him, that he might share his art for his own praise. And yet what we actually find at the opening of the Iliad is an invocation. An invocation of a spirit. Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. Homer invokes an ancient spirit to come and inspire him to sing on this subject, on the subject of the wrath of Achilles. He invokes a spirit. He goes on to say, that wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain, whose limbs unburied on the naked shore devouring dogs and hungry vultures tore. Since great Achilles and Atrides strove, such was the sovereign doom, and such the will of Jove. Two mythological references there. We have the wrath of Achilles, which hurled the souls of mighty chiefs to Pluto's gloomy reign. Pluto, in the ancient mythology, was the god who oversaw the souls in the underworld after death. The souls of the great chiefs were cast by the wrath of Achilles into the gloomy reign of Pluto, that is, into death, into the underworld. And we'll learn more about that throughout our reading of Homer. Since great Achilles and Atrides strove, there was a conflict between two Greeks, Achilles and Atrides. That's the translation here by Pope. Atrides means son of Atreus. The son of Atreus is the famous ancient king Agamemnon, who's going to be one of the main characters of this poem. So a conflict broke out between Achilles and Agamemnon. Agamemnon was the king of the ancient Greek city Argos, and it's important to understand that in the ancient Greek world, there weren't organized nations as there are today. Men ruled what were called city-states, where a major city, a great city, operated as a state. Argos was one such city-state. Sparta was another city-state. Athens was a city-state. So these states were something like kingdoms organized around a central city and governed by what we might call a king. There were a number of different forms of government even then in the ancient world. Sparta, for example, was ruled by two kings called a duarchy. Argos is an example of a city that was ruled by one king, something like a traditional monarchy. This battle breaks out between Achilles and Atrides, the son of Atreus, that is Agamemnon. This conflict was the cause of the suffering of the Greek people. Such was the sovereign doom, such was the will of Jove. You may recognize the name Jove because Dr. Watson in Sherlock Holmes always used to exclaim, "By Jove." Jove is a form of the name Jupiter. Jupiter is used in the nominative case to refer to the chief of the gods. But when the name is used in other cases in a sentence, the other forms are used, and here we see Jove used in the translation. Such was the sovereign doom, such was the will of Jove. So the gods, in just the first few lines, are completely wrapped up in this history according to Homer. The great Trojan War, the events of the Trojan War were not merely human events, but they were events which were being directed by and which were participated in by the gods. And so we see the beginning of this religious instruction that to the ancient Greeks was their divine scriptures, their source of religious instruction, where the ancient ideas of the Greek gods and goddesses was to be studied and learned. And look at what we've also seen. We've also seen talk about the underworld. We've seen talk about the kingdom of Pluto in the afterlife. We've seen mention of some heavenly goddess to whom Homer speaks through prayer. And what I'd like you to see is that this is not a mere poem telling us a story. There's much more here. This is the ancient Greek religion at work, in practice. Homer himself being an inspired prophet, as it were, invoking a spirit to come to his assistance. And we'll see what assistance he's seeking in a minute. But Homer understands that he is entering into the councils of the gods to understand the will of God, to understand the relationship between the gods and men, of human events, historical events that shaped the world, how they related to the gods. And you can imagine the Greeks listening to the poet, learning of these things, thinking of these things. Who is Jupiter? Who is Pluto? What does happen to us when we die? What is this wrath of Achilles? What is wrath? Is wrath good or bad? Where does wrath come from? What is the cause of human conflicts? What is the cause of human suffering? Is human suffering willed by the gods? What exactly is our relationship to the gods? You can see that Homer begins to introduce us to this ancient religion, ancient philosophy, ancient history. All of these lessons are going to be taught through the details of this poem, every detail of which was composed by Homer. And if that doesn't start to blow your mind, remember, it's all written in dactylic hexameter, 24 books. We're just a few lines in. Achilles' wrath to Greece, the direful spring, of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. That wrath which hurled to Pluto's gloomy reign the souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain, whose limbs unburied on the naked shore, devouring dogs and hungry vultures tore. Since great Achilles and Atrides strove, such was the sovereign doom, and such the will of Jove. Homer continues with this invocation. Declare, O Muse, in what ill-fated hour sprung the fierce strife? From what offended power Latona's son a dire contagion spread, and heaped the camp with mountains of the dead? The king of men, his reverent priest, defied, and for the king's offense, the people died. Again, Homer is in the midst of an invocation calling out to a spirit whom we now see referred to as a muse. And this muse is a spirit. Some refer to her as a spirit of poetry, but I think it would be better to refer to her as the spirit who inspired the poets. And we understand here what exactly the Greeks believed a poet to be. A poet was not a man who simply put words into verses. A poet was a man who was inspired by spiritual forces, spiritual persons, and was given powers to know things, to have wisdom that was supernatural. Homer, as the poet, understands that he, like a prophet, is dependent on these spiritual sources for his work. And so at the beginning, before he sets out to undertake this project, shows his reverence and makes this invocation, calling out to this heavenly goddess, to this spirit of poets, this ancient muse. Now, if you believe in angels and demons, what you need to grant is that it is entirely possible that Homer was in fact communicating with some spirit. There's nothing strange about that. There's nothing contrary to Christian teaching about that. He certainly could have, and if we give him the benefit of the doubt, he was influenced by a spirit to whom he prayed. And not only did he pray to this spirit, but he spoke of her when he composed and sang his poems to give her honor. He devoted the opening lines of both of his poems to this spirit, and would have everyone listening know perfectly well that these words were not simply his own words, but that they were inspired words, consecrated, as it were, by this ancient invocation. Now, we can immediately leap to the conclusion, as the Protestant fundamentalists would like to do, and say, oh, this means that he was inspired by demons. This shows us that Homer was demonic, that he was filled with devils, and that these ancient works of literature are demonic stories. Well, I'd like to ask you to hold off on judging the spirits and rather follow the advice of the apostle in the New Testament, who says, test the spirits. Test the spirits. The apostles taught us to resist what is evil and cling to what is good. And what I'd like to ask you to do, first of all, remember that this is being written 750 years before Christ. This is being written in a pagan land where there is no divine revelation. This is being written 750 years before Christ came into the world and destroyed pagan religion and sent the gospel to the ends of the earth. This is not a spirit rising up in contradiction against the church. This is not an evil spirit acting in Israel in opposition to the law of God in Israel. This is an unknown spirit. This is a mysterious spirit. This is a spirit influencing men outside of Israel long before the gospel ever arrives. And I'd like to ask you to consider this. Is it possible that this spirit which inspires Homer, is it possible that this is actually a good spirit sent by God Himself to help prepare the pagan people for the gospel that will one day come to them? Not to reveal the truth, because the truth without the Holy Spirit, which was not to be given until Christ atoned for the sin of the world, the Holy Spirit couldn't be given at this point anyway. But we have to ask, was the influence of this Spirit in human history good for human beings or harmful for human beings? Consider the historical context. Consider the time and place. Consider what these men could have been doing. These men could have been immersed in drunkenness, in immorality. These men could have been immersed in rude joking, disgusting, immoral talk. They could have been doing all sorts of evil without God in the world, far removed from Jerusalem. And yet we find these men in these foreign Gentile lands, talking about virtue and vice, of human happiness, of life after death, of spiritual influences that are invisible yet discernible, talking about morals and duties, religious obligations, moral obligations, order, government, justice. Does this really sound like the work of an evil spirit? That's what I'd like you to think about. Does this really sound like the work of an evil spirit? So let's consider that as we go along in our reading. In that last passage we read, "Declare, O Muse," or "Tell me, O Spirit," "Reveal to me," "Inspire me," "Tell me," in what ill-fated hour sprung the fierce strife? From what offended power, that is, from what spiritual being offended by some human action, did this evil come? And again, remember, Homer is teaching religion. Human evils come as a result of evil actions. In what ill-fated hour sprung the fierce strife? From what offended power? Latona's son. I'm not going to get into all of the details of mythology. If you're interested, I teach a whole course on mythology in the Academy. It's free. Enroll and study it. It's classical mythology actually taught by a Catholic priest. A famous old book on mythology. If you're interested in the details of this system of gods and goddesses, I encourage you to study that course. But I'm going to explain just what's necessary for the sake of understanding the story as we go through these poems. Latona's son is the god Apollo, one of the chief gods worshipped by the ancient Greeks. He's the god associated with the sun. Apollo, Latona's son, we read, spread a dire contagion. Apollo, for some reason, sent a plague among the Greek armies. And that plague was responsible for the death of many Greek soldiers. And Homer is asking the Spirit to reveal to him why this was done. What was the cause of all of that death and evil? What led Apollo to unleash this terrible plague among the Greek men? And Homer then continues and reveals to us the answer. He says, the king of men, that is Agamemnon, Achilles' enemy in this conflict, the king of men, his reverent priest defied. In other words, Agamemnon defied and offended the priest of Apollo, who we'll read about shortly. The king of men, his reverent priest, defied, and for the king's offense, the people died. And again, we have here moral philosophy. For the king's offense, the people died. For the king's offense, the people died. We have here instruction relating to religion, religious duties. We have here instruction relating to health and medicine. We have here instruction relating to political science and government. We have here instruction relating to human history and the causes of human events. All of this, I want you to see, all of this is contained in Homer's poem. So the first important lesson we learn as the Iliad opens is that a strife developed between Agamemnon, the king of Argos, who was the leader of the Greek armies in the Trojan War, and the priest of Apollo. This offense against the priest of Apollo also set Agamemnon at odds with Achilles, as well as the god Apollo himself, who unleashed as a punishment a plague that decimated Agamemnon's people, the Greek soldiers. And so this is the beginning of the Iliad and the introduction to the theme of this poem. The opening line, remember, was Achilles' wrath. And we have yet to learn what the cause was of Achilles' wrath. But we see Agamemnon, the king, having committed some sin against Apollo, dishonoring a priest, brought upon his people great suffering and death. And that's why I'd like you to continue to think as we go along. Think, is this a message from an evil spirit leading men away from God into sin? Or is this a spirit at an ancient point in history preparing men for the gospel which would come 700 years later? Remember the Song of Simeon, when Christ is brought into the temple by Mary and Joseph. Simeon holds up the child and says, "A light to lighten the Gentiles, and the glory of God's people Israel." Christ is the light to enlighten the Gentiles. But he was not to come for another 700 years. Is this Spirit speaking through Homer leading men to that light or away from that light? I'm of the persuasion that this Spirit is preparing men for the coming of that light, and is leading men maybe not even leading men to the light, but preventing men from moving further from that light. We're learning here of reverence for spiritual powers, reverence for priests. We're learning of the dangers that kings should fear for their sins. We're learning of the spiritual causes of human suffering. We're learning to think of death and life in the world to come. We're learning about the inspiration of men by divine spirits who know more than man, who are more powerful than man. And when you think of the sum total of these ideas, I leave it to you to answer the question, do you believe that this is a spirit that's leading men further from the truth or closer to it? Because I'll argue that if we consider what men could have been doing in 750 BC, and yet to find them doing this, and acknowledging that it's being influenced by some spirit, I would argue that this is a spirit that's doing good to men. And we're going to see another spirit like this in ancient history, in the spirit that Socrates says revealed truth to him as well. And so if we were to take some of the most influential of the ancient wise men, Homer, with these incredible poems, and Socrates, who is something of the father of what would grow to become scholastic philosophy, we find both of these sources of ancient Gentile wisdom, or wisdom among the Gentiles. We find this wisdom in both of these famous men being attributed to the influence of a spirit, or two different spirits. And we have to ask, are these spirits evil spirits? Or are these spirits sent from God to actually do good to the Gentiles and push them along, preparing them for the coming of the gospel? I'm going to stop this talk here because I happen to be walking in the evening and the sun is setting. But I'm going to stop here, and I'd like to leave you with this to meditate on. I'd like you to continue to think about this question of the spiritual nature of this poem. And I'd like to ask you to think, is there a reason why we should demonize this poem? Is it reasonable to accuse this spirit of being evil, considering what this spirit is going to do and its effect in the souls of men, which has affected human souls now for 2,700 years? Is the effect of this spirit good or evil? And when I say good, I do not mean perfect. I do not mean, is this the Holy Spirit? As I said, the Holy Spirit was not given to men outside of Israel and was not given to men until Christ's atoning work was completed. I'm not asking, is this the Spirit of Christ? God intended to reveal the truth through his chosen people Israel. We know that. Christ was born a light to lighten the Gentiles, the glory of God's people Israel. We're not to confuse good with perfection. We're not to confuse relative good with the absolute truth of the gospel. But I'd like you to consider, think of the scriptures, think of Catholic theology, and ask yourself and meditate on what the cause or what the source of this spiritual influence might have been, and whether we can find any information either in Scripture or in Catholic theology that might suggest to us what exactly this was to which Homer was praying. Because that's going to help us to understand the nature and benefit of this poem. And I'm going to stop there. I hope that you enjoyed that as an introduction to Homer's Iliad. I intended to take time, don't think that we're always going to go this slowly, but I intended to take time to make sure we set a good foundation and got off to a good start. We've seen this opening invocation, and now in the next talk we'll get into the actual events of the poem. I hope that's helpful. If you'd like to discuss any of these things, I'd love to hear your thoughts as you're listening. If ideas pop into your head that you think are interesting or relate to other studies or scriptures or Catholic teachings, and you'd like to talk about them, I'd love to hear those thoughts. It's my hope and desire to stir up those thoughts. And I don't think that they're going to be insignificant or irrelevant. I'd like to hear what you're thinking as we read through and talk about these things. So please either comment on the videos if you're listening to this on YouTube, or send me an email. I'd love to know what you're thinking as we go along. As I said, I'm teaching this course in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy as English literature. I'm going to use these videos as a supplemental resource for the students in the course, and I invite you to study the course at no cost in the Academy. Simply go to classicalliberalarts.com and follow the instructions you find there, and you can hop in. And don't forget also about that mythology course, which is also available. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. Again, this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy on the Feast of All Saints' Day. This wasn't planned. I didn't plan this on All Saints' Day, but sort of an interesting meditation given the liturgical calendar today. And I pray that the saints who live in peace today, one thing I read in the Divine Office that was encouraging was to think about the reality that the saints live today in perfect peace, something that we can't comprehend, and that in that perfect peace they intercede for us. And so I pray that the saints would in fact intercede for all of us as we seek to study, to know God and His will through the scriptures and through the teaching of the church, and also to understand the events of human history and our own nature as we read and consider the writings of men. God, help us to understand these things, to know wisdom, and to be able to fulfill our vocation in this world, which is to go into the world and make disciples. God bless you all.